Hi, this is Justin Spring, and again, I got myself a little ahead of myself there. I always get a little echo when I when I come on. I forget to turn off my own speakers. I just wanted to remind you that this is a your call-in show. So if you want to call in, you know the number. It's on the broadcast page that you're at right now. But if you're not there, if you're coming in through Ustream itself, it's 941 306 1119. And of course, I'm on your Twitter too if you want to come in on that. And that's SoulSpeak Spring. But that's all on the broadcast page. So if you are viewing the program and you have a question or something comes up, I'm covering a lot of ground very quickly. Just call in and we'll have a little talk. This is not a scripted thing, so in fact we like to keep it nice and loose. I think this is the ninth session that we've had on the psychic unconscious roots of poetry. To use the words your psychic and unconscious is a kind of oxymoron, is that the unconscious is the realm of psychic activities, meaning that psychic activities issue from the unconscious, not from our conscious mind. They just enter our conscious mind and in the forms of voices or visions or some combination of them, whatever. Just to kind of recap a bit, we've been going on and we over the past just several sessions, I've made the claim that the conceptual components of pre-literate consciousness, and I didn't make this up myself, by the way, but it's partly due to the work of Julian Jaynes, but also a long mythic poem that came to me in 2001, right at the edge there of the year changeover, that kind of laid out the four conceptual forces in your pre-literate consciousness. At least that's what I figured it out to be eventually with the help of Alice Hickey. And if you're interested in psychic events, I'm not a psychic person, I'm not somebody who can channel or can do any of the things that are there are many intuitives and people with great psychic ability who have access to a non-conscious world. I'll put it that way. As to where it resides, nobody really has any idea, whether it's within us or without us. It's a non-physical world where time and space aren't the same as they are here. That's all I guess you can say about it. Factually, at least that's all that Carl Jung eventually had to just say about it. But it seems to have an endless depth, and it goes back in terms of the things that can dredge up back to our beginnings as humans, and perhaps even back further. But that's what Jung says about our archetypes, which are our collective memories. And he's talking there about the collective unconscious. There seems to be some part of our personal unconscious that is also shared with every other human being, so that the messages that come up to us can come up from our personal unconscious, but if it's a message of some consequence, it will come up out of the collective unconscious as well. And that's where the long mythic poem, which I call the Witness's Log, came from. Eventually I was able to determine that because I couldn't figure out what the hell it meant or why I couldn't understand it if it was my poem. And if you're interested in that kind of event and how they can turn your life upside down, basically, you might want to take a look at Alice Hickey. You can see it simply by going to our web page and at soulspeak.org, or you can go to justinspringbooks.blogspot.com, or you can just go to my page here, which is a link to everything in the world, basically, that I've done artistically, so that's one way to get at it. But either way, no matter how you go, you'll eventually wind up taking a look at Alice Hickey. And it's a 7-year record of a unwinding of some psychic events, including a long mythic poem that literally overwhelmed me at the years 2000, 2001, and I spent 7 years with Alice Hickey trying to understand them. And one of the things that came out of that journey is that I became convinced, and Alice agreed with me, that the conceptual components of at the time of creation of a poem are exactly mirrored in the elements that are present in the pre-literate consciousness, which means that the pre-literate consciousness, the components that make it up in terms of the conceptual components and the components that you make up the moment called poetry when it comes to us, are literally identical for all intents and purposes. That means that the pre-literate consciousness was a highly psychic consciousness, meaning it slipped back and forth between what we know as consciousness, which is rock solid. We're here, we're eating a McDonald's burger, and we're giving the guy 50 cents or whatever they cost nowadays. He's giving us change. It's a real solid world, and it tends to maintain itself, whereas it seems to be quite evident, as Julian Jaynes points out in a very convincing book, which if you haven't read it, and if you're interested at all in what it was like to live in a pre-literate culture and be a pre-literate man, you should take a look at this. And this is a groundbreaking book that says that these people had a different consciousness than we have. We have a kind of consciousness that allows us to project ourselves into the future. If we're kind of presented with a new problem, basically what will happen is we kind of project ourselves into going to Europe and learning French and whatever, and marrying a beautiful French woman, and thereby escaping all of the doldrums of the United States or whatever. When you're faced with boredom, whereas the pre-literate man had no such ability to project. He basically lived in the present in a kind of state of meditation, much as what we do when we're going for long drives in our car, and we go 15 or 20 miles, and we suddenly look up, and we've been able to steer the car, avoid accidents, do everything, change lanes, but we had no conscious memory of it. It was done by some kind of subconscious steering, So what happens is that's the way that pre-literate man existed. He lived in that state of, it's a kind of meditation. You would say it was a state that was similar to meditation. And I think anybody familiar with those cultures will tell you that in fact, those that still exist, say in New Guinea, that the people can sit for hours and hours and hours just kind of staring at the sun or a rock, and then they can come alive and they can do things. When presented with a novel situation, one they hadn't seen before, what happened is that Jaynes says the gods would speak to them, and for Jaynes the gods were the right side of our brain, which had linguistic capabilities prior to the invention of reading and writing. Somewhere around the conception of reading and writing, our consciousness began to change to one which was essentially one that existed in a state of meditation and that heard voices all the time. So it was a kind of psychic consciousness, and that a pre-literate man would you take action, based on those voices. And I think it's pretty evident that that's so, So in a sense, you could say that poetry, which is the onset of voices that eventually resolves itself into a special story that we know to be true and beautiful, is very similar to those moments that would occur when the voices spoke to a pre-literate man when he had something new to do. They're not quite, and I'm going to go into that a little bit later. Jaynes was correct in intuiting that the voices and the stories that come to us in the act of poetic creation are a remnant or allied to those voices that we heard when we lived in a pre-literate state, but they're not exactly the same. And that's something that one is a guiding voice or a commanding voice, and those are the voices that the pre-literate man heard. And he also heard another set of voices which weren't so commanding, that were not guiding, but were story voices that came. And I'll just simply say they were more human sounding. They were more brotherly. I guess that's the best way to put it. That's how, in fact, I've experienced both kinds of voices. And it's one that's a kind of loving, touching voice. It's not for guidance, but it's to you pass an emotion through you and on to others in the form of a story. And it's a slightly different voice than the guiding, commanding voice, which has an authority to it of a commanding presence rather than a presence that is, I would say, that is a artistic presence. That's the best I can describe it to you, It wants to create a story through us that will express the feelings of the unconscious. Well, with all that said, I just wanted to go back and I wanted to just recap, because what we came to a point last week is where I worked my way through some of the work of Robert Graves. For some reason, let me see if I can find a little picture of Robert here in his White Goddess, the book that came out of in the, I would say, somewhere in the 60s, I think, the White Goddess. It was about the same time that the book from Janes came out, but they don't really reference one another. I don't know why. It could be that, one, in terms of Graves' book, is almost impossible to read, despite being a very good writer. I don't know how he ever got it published. If it weren't for the fact that he was a renowned scholar, poet, and historic novelist, that I think that any publisher would have thrown it out the window. It's very disconnected and it's very hard to read. And but if you kind of plow your way through it, that one of the conclusions that Graves comes to, and it's one that's almost accepted by him without any kind of questioning at all, is that the roots of poetry lie in the pre-literate times, and that the reason that we experience a moment of ecstasy, he calls it something else, he calls it a moment of fear, but there's that slight element of it too. When the unknowable becomes known, there's always that moment, but it makes the hair in the back of your neck stand up. He said that. I think that's the best way to describe it. Is this when a poet accidentally or on purpose imitates one of the 13 themes that we use to praise the Mother Goddess. In other words, poetry as we know it today, poems that move us emotionally, poems of the moon, he calls them, as opposed to poems of the sun, which are kind of consciously contrived and may have rhythm and may have beautiful metaphors and beautiful similes, but they don't close properly. They're not messages from the unconscious. They're just imitations of those, basically. And I would say that makes up the bulk of what we call literature today in terms of the poetry end of it. But Graves was just smart enough to understand that there were two kinds of poems, and he wrote a lot of poems of the sun, I'm afraid to say, but somewhere in there are some poems of the moon. And those poems of the moon are linked back to the Mother Goddess, back to the pre-literate times. He took a completely different tack than was taken by Janes, who was a scientist with a taste for poetry, whereas Graves had no science in him at all. He was just an artist through and through, and he was a scholar as well. But they came to somewhat the same conclusions, that the poetry was linked and is established and comes into being in the advent of pre-literate consciousness. Roughly, they're both talking about the same thing. And Graves goes one step further, and he says that the Mother Goddess is also the muse, or it's the beginning of the muse, which eventually came as we passed into what we would call literate times, with all its male gods, etc. And I'll show you a male god. I like this little Hercules. He's pretty handsome. Staid female. the muse state female, it's the one remnant that we have today of the mother goddess right up into contemporary times, right at the time I'm talking to you. If you talk to a poet, they'll always reference the muse. You can call it anything you want. You can call it the poetic impulse, the artistic unconscious, the archetype called poetry, the muse, whatever it is. But it's a presence that comes to us psychically, unannounced, seizes our consciousness, and through us tells a story. And as Homer says, that speaks to men and the gods. It's aimed at two places. A little bit different than a prose work, a novel, which speaks only to men. I'll just give you a little kind of a sidelight on that it may be interesting. When I first became interested in doing oral poetry, that is not a poetry that you memorize or you have to think about, you get little pieces in your head, but just going to Zen no mind and somehow finding the avenue to let a poem rise up out of my unconscious and create itself as pre-literate man did. There was no schools for poetry, there was no literature, there was just what you heard as it traveled through the wind as you were moving through. And indeed, the very first poem had no antecedents. And I'll go into that in a few minutes, but really that the thing that I was interested in and that I kind of stepped through the looking glass, as I said, I kept pursuing it with myself and a poet by the name of Scylla Liscombe, is that we kept pursuing it for, I would say, at least 2 years, and we kept falling on our asses. We just couldn't figure out how to do it. There are no books on it by how to do it. There's only books about it, about certain aspects of Homer's work, which are formulaic, which won't bother to get into that, but they don't tell you how to do it, or nobody knows how to do it because there are no books on it. So I had originally wanted to do it because we were doing a lot of theater at the time. In Soul Speak, we were performing our written work. We would memorize part of it, and then we would speak it out, and we had all kinds of ways of doing that. With dancers and with musicians and actors and things like that. So we had a pretty lively theater at the time of what we were doing, but that's not what I wanted to do. Somehow I wanted to have an immediate bond between myself and the audience so that as it happened to me, it would happen to the audience. I wanted to actually make the hotcakes right in the audience. I didn't want to make the hotcakes somewhere back and bring them cold and then kind of dish them out to everybody. That's the way readings are done today, and it's horrible. I'm sorry, they're just horrible. But that's what we have today. And I always thought that in fact it would allow me to speak in that intense, rhythmic way. When a poem comes to you, it's a wonderful experience. It just fills you with music and rhythm, and a story pours out of you. This is at least in the written experience, but it's exactly the same in the true oral experience, by the way, but it's even more intense, is that I wanted to come out and I wanted that bond to happen between ourselves and the audience is what I had in mind. But as I started to do it, I found that I couldn't, that in fact, as soon as I learned how to do it, which took us a couple of years, and we eventually knew it, and how you do it is you surrender to it. You simply close your mind off and you wait for the poetic impulse to come. You can kind of tease it up if you want, but basically you have to wait. It's the same as a written poem, and when it comes to you just have to speak it out in the form of a story, in the form of a narrative poem, because that's the way the unconscious works. And it taught me the lesson that I should have known, that all scholars should know also, but in fact they don't quite get it, is that all pre-literate poetry is story poetry, because that's the way the unconscious works, and that's the way we dream, okay? So if you simply let it go and you let a story form and come out and let it have its way, the poem would form. It would have its own rhythm, its own metaphors. There's nothing you had to do at all. You simply had to obey what was coming up to you and recite the story as it presented itself to you, and everything would be taken care of. It was like a no-brainer, basically. You just shut off your thinking mind, and that's the kind of mind that pre-literate man had. he had a non-thinking mind. He wasn't an analytical person in the sense as we are today. You know, he wasn't a critical person. He just simply did, and you can see that, for example, in the portrayal of the warriors in the Iliad, which is Homer's great portrait of pre-literate culture, warrior culture, which existed around 1200, 1500 BC. Homer was speaking his poems around 800 BC, about 700 years later. But somehow he was able to portray, because he was still a pre-literate poet, that kind of immediacy of action that you get from the pre-literate heroes. Not a lot of thinking and scheming. It's action. They're just in each other's face. You know, there's a little planning here and there, but in fact, they're there to fight, to either live or die. And it's that immediacy of their reactions to every situation, including those where in fact the gods come to them to guide them. It happens to be, but it's a non-reflective heroes. They're not Hamlets soliloquizing forever what I'm going to do. They just do. They just do. And one of the things that I found is that as I started to do this poetry in this no-brainer way, is that part of my attention was always focused on the gods. Just like Homer says, I sing to men and to gods. Part of your attention is towards your audience, because when you're speaking, you have to speak to somebody, or else it just stops. If you try to, but there are two entities that you're speaking to. There is those who are around you, who you could say are your audience, if you want to think of them that way. And there's the gods. That was a big eye-opener for me as to that your poetry is always speaking back to the gods. The gods may come in the form of the muse to actually deliver the song to you in forms of emotions that work their way up through some miracle into rhythmic, metaphoric stories. But there's something in those stories that want to be addressed also back to the gods. That's sometimes referred to as the perfect listener. I've gone into that. Every poet knows that. It's when a poem comes to you and you're writing it out, you don't have any doubt that somewhere, it's just intuitive, not even thinking about it, that there's a perfect listener who understands, the perfect understander, someone hearing you. And it's interesting is that poets, even who refuse to understand or to give an inch that your poetry can be an oral art, despite Homer and everything, it's just beyond me, but who only insist that poetry can only be written, the fact of the matter is that their term for the presence that they address is the perfect listener. Okay, so because the listener can only hear when you speak. It's like the fact you're writing, speaking, so it's a kind of throwback, and I've often kind of coin tossed as to whether that's another aspect of the muse or just something much larger, and I'm still at odds with that as to whether that's the God, the muse that comes to us, and then when we speak it out or we write it, there's something about it that we are addressing some non-physical presence, and we want to get it exactly right. That's the trick. We know there's an understanding presence, we just feel it, and we are addressing that, and we want to get it right. That's the real task of the poet, is to return the feelings that have come up from the unconscious and fashion themselves into a story by mating with our conscious minds. That story is a way of carrying feelings. All stories are a way of carrying feelings. That the story and the words are just the spear carriers in the opera. The real thing is the song, the feeling of the song that is going back. And what I have come to believe is that the unconscious or the muse or the gods, whatever you want to call it, the unknowable, wants that back, that feeling made back, but touched with the human experience, made glittery with time, is the way it came to me. And one of those voices that Graves called analeptic, he made that up. It's really what happens is when you hit an area that you don't know how it happened. Sometimes the unconscious will supply exactly how it happened, and he called that voice an epileptic. Basically, what happens is that it supplies you with the answer. And in fact, what happens is that the thing that came to my mind, the voice that came to my mind, said that the listening presence, whatever you want to think of it as, the muse or something maybe larger than the muse, whatever it is, it was bringing it back in, a more passive presence, wanted to feel its feelings that had come up from the unconscious, brought back to it, but made glittery with time. And that's exactly what a poem does. The emotions don't come from us. They're somewhere connected. They're all connected to our emotions, but there's something even deeper that comes up, something that perhaps we weren't aware of. And it works its way forward, becomes a rhythmic, a metaphoric story that brings us to a point of ecstasy. And in so doing, it's made human. Those feelings come out of the unconscious and are made human and made glittery with time. And then that's the way that the unconscious can feel them. It doesn't know words. The unconscious, what it knows is it knows feelings, and it wants to hear those feelings back. It wants to know what it feels like to be human. And as I said before, that the conscious and unconscious, I think, are two parts of us. That I would take the unconscious to be what was originally our animal consciousness, as our human consciousness broke free, stayed on top of it, very, very fragile at first, and the two need to stay together. And the unconscious wants the conscious mind to stay with it. And it keeps feeding it and wants to hear back, like brothers. It's very important. That's something that I think every spiritual thinker will tell you. Mind and soul, body and soul, spirit and mind, you go on and on, but it's the conscious part of us, the part we can control, and it's the part that we can't control that seems to have its own life. It's our life, but it's not one we can control. It grieves, it goes into ecstatic, it loves, and it wants to always be in constant communication with us, and that makes for a healthy human being, to realize the totality of who you are. People who live totally in their minds, I believe, conscious minds, have a greater possibility of becoming schizophrenic. And what Jane says schizophrenia is a holdback. It's when the older consciousness, the remnants of it, break through and seize complete control of consciousness. And at that stage of the game, as any schizophrenic will tell you who has lived through the experience and has recovered from it, is that you can't ignore the voices. The voices are overwhelming and they're constant. One of the prices that you pay sometimes when you don't have that life going back and forth in the way that poetry makes possible. Poetry is the passageway. It's the original prayer. It's the original prophecy. It's the original. I'll go into that later too, about the original prophecy. I don't want to get too crazy on you right here, but you can think of it as a praise act that came very early to man, and your praise being of the unknowable, of the gods, whatever you want to think of it, as the original poetry was prayer. They were the same. Only much later did they get divorced into separate entities, and you both have suffered for it in a way. Prayer especially, because prayer, in order to communicate with the gods, as anybody will tell you, especially this fellow here, who is in constant touch with the gods. Let me bring him up again. You can't speak to the gods if you're in your conscious mind. That's just make-believe. That's like talking to the Ford salesman that you want a new Ford. You have to go out into that borderline between your conscious mind and your unconscious mind, and you have to speak. You have to pray from that point of view. You have to praise God from that point of view if you're a spiritual, religious person who in fact believes in a personal God. Poetry was the original vehicle for men to speak to what they perceive to be the gods. So it's, those two are really intimately connected, and you have to really get into, prayer should be a close to psychic activity. It's really what it should be. You have to get right on the borderline to pray, because what you want is, you want to come up from your unconscious with the totality of your humanity and let it become a poem, if you will. It doesn't have to. It'll become a poem by itself. It's your story to the gods. It just happens. It just happens. But I'll go into the history as to how those you split apart much later as we approached the age of literacy, how they kind of split apart. And also I want to go into at some stage as to how prophecy, or the guiding voices, the voices that men first heard to guide them in as to what they do, as to how they're related to the voices of the muse, which are slightly different. And I believe were an adaptation, if you will, or it was man's imitation of the guiding voices he heard, which eventually became internalized and became a kind of special way that the gods, or the right-hand side of the brain, spoke to us. It became more human. That's all I can say, because because in men, when they imitated the gods and tried to speak like the gods in these rhythmic, metaphoric ways, it was their human voice that they were speaking with, and somehow the unconscious pulled that in, and pulled in also that human love and praise that was coming from the human beings to it. So a poem was always an act of love as it comes to us. It may be exhilarating and ecstatic, but even the darkest poem has an element of love and an element of bonding to it, So we can spend some time, in fact, in the future, in fact, in going into that. But the important thing is to see that poetry is the way that the unconscious speaks to us and through us to others, and then back to itself. It's like a constantly refreshing cyclic system, if you will. And I'd just say one more thing before we sign off today. I'm going to play a little dream story for you, which is a modern version of what poetry sounded like in those days. As I made a statement last week, is that the first man, or the first human, was a woman, because it was the only way that humanness would have survived. Because if you had two animals, very smart animals, all of a sudden they produced a human animal that, scientifically speaking, but in fact I'm going to say even humanly speaking, that our chances would have been much better if that first human, in this theoretical situation, okay, where there's nothing else in the world except the two animals, and then there's a human, or a female human rather than a male human, because the male human doesn't really nurture, just goes off and has more matings, whereas the female will in fact eventually come of your mating age, and if more, and in fact it may be mating with another animal again. This is the human girl who's grown up to be a mother, but in fact it may produce another human. It may produce another animal too. Very, very kind of shaky in the beginning, but it's that nurture. The mother is always looking for itself in the child, and what makes us human is our ability to tell stories. I have to go into that in some depth to you here, but you can't learn to tell stories unless you have somebody encouraging you to tell stories. You have to have a listener, and that's really important. So in fact the mother wouldn't be out trying to mate again. She may mate again. After all, everybody's very active in those days, but she's going to spend time with that child. Time that an animal mother, although the animal mother would have been very good, we know they take care of things that are not their own, but the mother would have been trying to make contact with that human baby in a special way, and the human baby would have responded in the way that the animal baby wouldn't have. It would have recognized the story. That's a mystery right there, so we'll kind of talk about that next time. that's one of those Einsteinian things. As I said last week, you create a kind of theoretical situation that's totally wild. And he used to do it in terms of he had himself a broomstick and a shaft of light were the only things in the universe, and he came to some enormous insights into the nature of time and space doing that. We can also, if Einstein can do it, we can do it. We can set up a world in which there are two animals who produce perhaps a male human or perhaps a female human, and I'm saying that the female human is the key to the human race progressing on, because it takes two to witness, to tell stories. You need a listener and a speaker. Listener has to be constantly reinforced for that animal to grow in its humanness, okay? Won't work any other way. That's why if you talk to a chimpanzee until your pants fall down, you're getting nowhere. It's just a headache, and you might get socked by the chimpanzee who's just tired of getting yacked at, doesn't understand what's going on at all. Anyway, I've opened a lot of doors there, which in fact, as usual, I'm not going to close. Let me just play one about the psychic world in general. Let me see what I got here. I'm going to play this one again, which I think I may have played for you, but it's called Candles, and it's a dream story that came out of an event that happened in Mexico on Christmas Eve. I was sitting there with some friends, and this is what happened. Basically, we had taken pictures, and weird things were happening, and we had a 7-candlestick, a stick with 7 candles on it, and one kept going out, and we were taking pictures and eating a real Mexican meal, which was brutal. It was menudo. I wanted to see what it was like to eat. But anyway, when we put the pieces together in the morning and we looked at what we had done in terms of pictures, and this poem came out of me. So here it goes. There were 7 candles on the table, but one kept going out. No matter what I tried, only 6 stayed lit. Only 6. And then someone, a voice said to me, maybe it's your brothers or your sisters. Maybe one of them is dying. And I thought to myself, that could be. It's getting to that time we can all hear the scratching at the door at night. And then another voice said, maybe it's you. Maybe it's you who's dying. And I said to myself, it could be. Why else would I be here in the middle of the desert? In the middle of the night, slowly disappearing. And then another voice said, listen to me, Justin. Maybe it is one of your brothers or your sisters who's dying, or maybe it's not that. Maybe it's you're the one who's dying. You should know. Or maybe it's not either of those, but something you'll know years from now. Or maybe at the moment of your death. It's all connected, Justin. You just don't know how or what these things mean. But they always mean something.